Just to say, my name is Charmaine Brown. I'm a Peckham resident for 35 years plus. I have been active in the community, both as a teacher, on various committees for community groups, and as a community activist. And I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Greenwich, and my subject is initial teacher education.
Can you pull the door half shut, but don't shut it totally?
Okay, Charmaine, shall we?
We can start now, yes. I'm going to turn off my video for the duration of the presentation, and I'll come back on camera for the Q&A at the end. And I'd invite anybody on the Zoom right now, if there's any particular slide that they need to, that they want to raise a question on or comment on, they can do that in the chat box. And please just number the slide that you're referring to when we come back for Q&A at the end. So we can start now, Claire.
Okay, thanks, Charmaine. I'll just go on to the screen share. Okay, can everyone see that okay?
Yeah.
It's going to make it a bit bigger. Okay, off you go, Charmaine.
All right. So as the title slide suggests, the lecture is about the regeneration, gentrification, and urban renewal, and in particular, the impact on the Caribbean community in Peckham. And then we're going to proceed to the next slide, which gives us a taste of Peckham's history. And on that slide, you'll see there's 5 pictures, and those pictures represent Peckham at a certain period in history. At the top, there's a block picture with text. The text is written in Old English, and it actually is an entry in the Domesday Book, 1086. And on the third line, where the first word on the third line that starts with a P and it's highlighted, it's the red strikes through, that's actually the Old English for Peckham. And it says Petracha, but the other word people remember Peckham as is Petronam. That's old-fashioned English for Peckham. So Peckham was a manor owned by King Henry I, as noted in the Domesday Book, and it was a very small settlement of just 4 households at the time of that entry. Another bit of information and history about Peckham, that it's actually situated in Surrey County, the original borders, and was administered by Camberwell Parish Vestry. Peckham also was known for having a branch of the Surrey Canal, which ended on what is now Peckham Square. Okay, and Peckham also was the site of the River Peck. The River Peck is still running, and it trickles through Peckham Rye Park. Other pictures on the screen depict other parts of Peckham's history, and you can see there are sheep, or picture of sheep. The second picture from the top, or the middle picture, you'll see a black and white picture with sheep. That's actually sheep grazing on Peckham Rye Park. And other pictures that relate to the history, we have the last picture in the first column, that is either a dairy or a farm. So there is Woods Road Dairies and Homestead Farm. And the last picture to the right, just above the writing, is the site of the River Peck, which still runs through Peckham Rye. So basically, Peckham has a history, and the point I'm trying to make is that Peckham, it's a myth that Peckham is urban. It's actually suburban, and it has strong links to the whole suburban history, which is where Peckham used to serve the City of London. So it used to provide fresh produce, dairy produce, and so forth to the city. Okay, so if we just go on to the next slide, but before I start to talk about the next slide, I just want to give a bit of background to the purpose of today's talk, and that's about capturing what is regeneration, what is gentrification, and then we talk about the impact on the Caribbean community. And I just want to highlight a definition of, or an understanding of regeneration. And urban regeneration is the attempt to reverse that decline by both improving the physical structure and, more importantly, the economy of those areas. So that's what regeneration symbolizes. Let's turn to gentrification. We know that Ruth Glass coined the term gentrification in 1964 when she was describing working class quarters of Islington and how it was at the time, and what she says, rundown cottages and modest mews houses, and how over a period of time it underwent a period of gentrification. In other words, a new class of people came in, what they termed at the time the middle class, and the working class, which were the original occupants, were displaced. A kind of summary of gentrification for me is one done by John Howley, in 1979, when he says, gentrification is a name given to the process by which the original working class inhabitants of an area are displaced and the whole social character of the neighborhood is changed. The gentry, inverted commas, are members of the middle classes, professionals and managerial people. Now, in 2015, Peter Frost, chairman of Peckham Society, in an interview that was done on the changing nature of Peckham, he stated for him, regeneration meant the influx of money, and he said millions have been pumped into central Peckham. And he distinguished gentrification, which he stated was the elimination of poor people because they can't afford to live in the area. So my question is to those listening on Zoom is, when we look at regeneration and gentrification, is there a causal link? Is there a relationship between the two concepts? Are the concepts interchangeable? And does one concept become the other? In other words, does regeneration become gentrification? So it's actually a single concept. So we're going to talk about this slide now, which is on the class system, and it really ties in very neatly to regeneration and gentrification. And as you can see, the UK started very much as a pyramid structure. So it was very clear cut that there was the elite at the very top, the smallest percentage of the UK were elite, the upper classes. The middle classes had the next portion, and people largely, by this definition, post-war definition, and we're talking about Professor Ken Roberts' definition, were largely working class. As time progressed, and with regeneration and then gentrification, the UK class structure over time morphed from a pyramid shape to a pear shape. In the second picture, the elite still has that small percentage at the top of the pear, but the middle section has got wider. In other words, through social mobility and other things, there became an enlarged middle class and the working class has become smaller. In the final picture, again, the elite, the upper classes, remain the smallest percentage. The middle classes, including the newly emerged middle classes, which are the next, is the biggest portion, but there's some confusion because it's not so clear cut now how these different classes remained in the state they were in post-war. So in the last picture you see is what we say is, you know, it was fluid between the middle and the working classes. If you can go upwards socially mobile, and then through recession or other misfortunes, you can go down the ladder. So it's like, as they say, running up and down escalator. So the last two sections, the middle and the work, is quite fluid. It's not so clear cut like once upon a time. So we'll move on to the next picture and see why we're talking about the class structure. The next picture is entitled, the next slide, sorry, Not Our Problem. And it's Not Our Problem, I should say, is on YouTube. And if you type in Not Our Problem 1984, you'll come up with the YouTube video that was made by Southwark Council regarding their council race strategy. So because of the issues with the economy and the, especially in terms of education, housing and jobs, Southwark started a task force which was split into a race equality committee and a race unit to look at the impact of education, housing and jobs on a particular section of the community, and that was the Caribbean community. It was what they say, it was a black and white issue, and that's there's a colour film on that. So if you look at in the middle of that picture, there's a map. It's a blue map if you can see it clearly, and it's got orange bits dotted out. Now those orange bits showed where what they say is in this time the black population were concentrated, and that was middle of the borough, which was East Dulwich and Peckham, and in a particular part of Peckham, which is very relevant to today's talk, and it's the areas which were regenerated and then later gentrified, by and large, the bits that I'm going to be talking about. And what you have, I've selected 3 quotes from people who were interviewed as part of the Southwark video. And the first person that was interviewed at the time, his status was mayor, and that was Sam King, the first black mayor in Southwark. He was Jamaican origin. He came on the Windrush, the Empire Windrush. And he states, whenever people or institutions stop other people from living a normal life, for example, in education, housing and jobs, that's when there is race inequality. Another interviewer who was just labelled a female interviewer states, prejudice feeds on ignorance. Once we make personal contact, then it becomes easy for us to explain that we're not a burden. We're also contributing to society and we have something. That's what her take on racial inequality was in this particular area. And at the then Councillor Aubin Graham says inequality is about prejudice and power. So this slide is very important, and because it puts into context what I'm going on to talk about in terms of how gentrification has impacted on Caribbean communities in Peckham. Let us remind ourselves by going to the next slide about some of the examples of regeneration in Peckham. On the next slide, we'll be looking at the North Peckham estate. And that was one of the phases of regeneration. And for those of you who might be familiar with the North Peckham estate, this period of regeneration spanned from 1994 to 2004. The biggest picture you can see on the right is the demolition of the North Peckham, well, one part of the North Peckham estate. And the top picture to the left is a view of one of the estates in Peckham before demolition. And if your eyes are keen enough, you might be able to see between the 2 buildings on the top left picture, there is, although there's a wall there, there was actually walkways that linked one estate to the other. So the North Peckham estate is a global name. There's other ones like Gloucester Grove and others in between, spanned from Peckham High Street to the Old Kent Road. The bottom left picture is how, following regeneration, the council's town housing style that was replaced the actual flats. So you'll see a townhouse at the bottom of the screen, and that was what was replaced the actual block of flats. So that's one zone of regeneration, and there's a lot more I can say on it, but I'm going to move on. So if we look to the next slide, we're looking at the Bellenden renewal zone, and that period of regeneration spanned from 1997 to 2007. Now, if we just have a quick look, and I'll talk you through some of the images. The top left is a Victorian picture of Bellenden Road at that time, and then the more modern picture of Bellenden Road at the exact same spot. So there's a replica of an exact space in the 19th century and in the 21st century. When we look to the right of that picture, we'll see a regenerated cafe, which has had different names over time, and is also significant to impact when we talk about Caribbean communities and displacement. The bottom picture on the left-hand side, the black and white picture, is a section of Bellenden Road, another section. I would date it roughly in the 1970s by the look of the cars. It could be slightly later, but it's around that period. And the actual same stretch of road, the exact same stretch of road, following Regeneration. And the reason why you can see it's distinct, it's following Regeneration, is because some of the street furniture that present in the picture on the right, and by street furniture, I'm talking about the lamppost, which wasn't in the picture on the left. So that kind of dates when the picture on the right was taken. So these pictures are all stock photographs. I think most of them were uploaded by the Peckham History Society, and you can just Google them. But what's very important is that the picture on the left, it has, I don't know if you can see the screen clearly, but it has, it's a very busy street, and there's quite a few people in the picture. Now, it's very important when looking at the people in the picture, because it goes to an era of when people from the Caribbean had a lot of business on Bellenden Road. So if you just hold on 1 second, I'll say 1 second. Sorry about that. Yeah, so the picture at the bottom of the screen has got quite a few people in it, and it does point to an era when Bellenden Road was heavily populated with Caribbean businesses. So I'm just going to give a summary. So by looking at this picture, I can tell what was happening. I can actually, my senses are very alive in terms of sight, sound, smell, and conversations that would have been taking place. At the time of this picture, you had Caribbean takeaways, Caribbean restaurant owned by the same person. You had a minicab office owned by a Caribbean person. You had a shoemaker's shoe repair shop. You had a grocer's shop. You had a Caribbean landlord that ran a pub, which is still on Bellenden Road. You had a women's centre, Peckham Black Women's Centre. You had social clubs, and you had a lot of cottage industry that was taking place in the houses on this road. So if you were around during that era, you would be well aware what was happening. And the reason I point to the picture at the top right of the, it's now called the Begging Bowl, and it was formerly the Peckham Experiment. That actually at one stage was a grocery store that was owned by a Caribbean shop owner. So at this time, that picture on the left, bottom left, was taken. There was thriving Caribbean businesses on Bellenden Road, either on the road or in the houses on Bellenden Road and surrounding roads. There's a lot of cottage industries. So if we move on now to the next picture, which is also on Bellenden Road during its transition phase.
Oh, sorry.
That's fine. The next slide. All right, so what you see here, you've got a better look of what they call the street furniture on Bellenden Road. So you can see the lampposts, which were designed by, I corrected on previous lectures, by Tom Phillips. And you had the cast iron metal bollards in the picture just behind the white van that was designed by Anthony Gormley. So there was a series of designers who were transforming street furniture during the regeneration phase, not only in Peckham, but also in places like neighbouring places like East Dulwich, where Zandra Rhodes was credited with the lamppost in East Dulwich because they've got a colour design on them. So there was a team of designers, including Zandra Rhodes, that had the contract to redesign some of the aesthetics of the streets within the regeneration area. And the reason I call it the transitional phase is, if we look at the picture on the right, which is split in two, it's the same business. So someone's got their, someone needs to turn off the microphone. Thank you. And what you see is, you see at the top right-hand picture, it says Payless Food Hall. At the bottom, even though some of the words cut off, it says Village Grocers. They're one and the same business. And when it was Payless, it was Payless before Regeneration, but you can see the bollards in front. It was in that phase. It benefited from that phase of Regeneration, and it was rebranded Village Grocers. Now, the significance in this, and there's other shops on Bellenden Road that have followed this same pattern. With gentrification came rebranding of businesses and rebranding of other things. Now, when it was Payless Food Hall, it catered to the local community. So in other words, whatever the local needs were, they would stock items for the local community. When it was rebranded as Village Grocers, it actually started not to continue to include the local community in what they stocked. It brought in a lot of new lines in line with the new residents who were the gentrifiers. So when it was Payless Food Hall, the shopkeepers would not accept bank cards because they said cash only. That's one of the things or the changes that the local people remarked on. When it was Village Grocers, they would accept any form of payment. Okay, so they was more trusting of the gentrifiers. That's the point that I'm trying to make. And sorry, can you turn off your
Hang on.
your microphone, please? Can you turn off your microphone, please?
Yes,
Thank you.
apologies.
No problem. So there's a lot of changes, and the local people who spoke to me said they went into Payless Food Hall. They went into the Village Grocers to buy products they normally brought when it was Payless Food Hall, only to be told we no longer stock those items. They're not popular. So the Village Grocers responded to the change in the market, the change in demographics, notwithstanding that the local community they're still members still in the community. So why not expand? My thing is, why not expand your range? That's fine, but do not exclude the original community that supported the business. So if we move on to the next slide, we'll see a more gentrified Bellenden Road. And some of you might be familiar with this picture. And we have the picture of our organic butchers, and you have a property not on Bellenden Road, but within in another conservation renewal area. We say conservation area, Ollie Grove. So I've just included those pictures, but it's very telling that the local residents, when asked about their views on gentrification in 2015, documented the following comments. And this, again, if you do a YouTube search for Peckham and gentrification, and you put in 2015, you will come up with this video, which I have not got time to play now, but you can play it in your own time. But some of the feedback from the local people said gentrification for them was social cleansing, influx of wealthy residents squeezing out locals. Someone else said they don't spend money on Rye Lane. Another person said middle classes move in. Another person said middle classes don't integrate. Push up house prices, working classes move out. Another view was they lead separate lives, do separate things. Shops are different. Rebranding Bellenden Road, Bellenden Village. So as I say, these are not my views. These are the views of people who were interviewed for a video specifically on gentrification. And most of the views came from people that were interviewed within the Bellenden renewal zone area. And the one person that was interviewed, Dr. Deirdre O'Neill, said she's a fourth generation person living in Peckham, and Peckham no longer feels like home. And she also stated people who come from Peckham don't come here. And when she refers to here, she's talking about Bellenden Road. So that video is very insightful out of all the videos on gentrification, because it really captures the local community feedback on how they view gentrification. So let's look at the Caribbean impact by going to the next slide.
Ooh.
So the next slide is entitled Keeping the Caribbean Legacy Alive. Black people's contribution to social and cultural forward, please. Next slide. Thank you. Black people's contributions to social and cultural capital in Peckham. Now, when I initially spoke about the slide on Bellinger, the initial slide, Regeneration slide, and I showed a black and white picture, I did give an insight into some of the industries that were thriving in Peckham, established by people from the Caribbean communities. Now looking at this slide, this is a very busy slide, but it's very significant. If there are people from the Caribbean on this Zoom call, it might evoke some memories and even some stories, some oral histories. And as you can see, the main picture is what was well known as the West Indian front room. Now, the West Indian front room was typical in any West Indian household. There's slight variations, but the general layout was typical for any Caribbean household in a period of in time. And for those of you who might be familiar, Dr. Michael Macmillan did a whole exhibition and a whole installation on the West Indian front room. And this is where I got the picture from, at the Jeffrey Museum in East London. And at subsequent, his installation went around the country, and it went on, and it came back, and it went on again, because it really put people back in time. Now, the West Indian front room, or a West Indian household, if we do it in general terms, was well known for a lot of things. And as well as the high street businesses, which was a latter development, a lot of Caribbean people relied on what we call the cottage industries, because of the legacy of racism, they were not given loans, or not offered loans, I should say, if they wanted to start a business. And they'd come from the Windrush generation with all this wealth of knowledge, skills, experience. Some of them was even recruited directly by Enoch Powell when he was in his role as a minister, when they wanted to bring skilled workers to the UK. So they came at that stage, and they came later, but they came with their skills. And this picture is very busy, but it represents a lot of the skills that were started in the home, because they weren't allowed to have properties outside the home at the time. And then it morphed into high street properties and established properties when things started to develop and when they had money. So if you're looking at the picture now, I'll just give you 20 seconds, anybody on Zoom, to see if they can pick up on any of the imagery, either side of the front room, and what it might represent in terms of a vacation or a service. And you can write it in the chat if there's anything that comes to mind, because some things might be familiar picture to somebody, but not another. And then it might be the same for different cultures. Okay, so Ruth is saying NHS. Okay, thank you, Ruth. Anybody else want to just quickly just put something in the chat? One word, 2 words? Taylor, thank you, Ruth. Okay, child-minding. Oh, some people are very versed in recognizing. Anything else they want to put in the chat? All right, I'll let one more thing, and then I'll just go through some of the imagery. Sewing. Thank you, Yvonne. Tailoring. Avril, sorry. Thank you, Avril. Sewing, Yvonne. Gardening. Okay. All right, let's just go through some of the items. Barber. Thanks, Yvonne. Carpentry. Thank you, Maurice. Car mechanic. I think some of you have seen my slides, or maybe you're just familiar with the pictures. All right, let's just go, just a quick look at the pictures. Start from the left, top left. All right, some people said that picture they thought was gardening. But if there's any females of a certain age from the Caribbean on this Zoom call, they'll recognize that as a curling iron. Yeah, related to hairdressing. So that was a very familiar curling iron. My mother's generation, when she went to the hairdresser in the hairdresser's home, They would heat that on the fire and they would put that in your hair and you'd click, click, click and make you curl your hair like rollers, modern day rollers. Yeah, so that was a curling iron. So a lot of there's a lot of hairdressers that did hairdressing in their homes. And then you have the picture below, you have a car. Yes, a lot of people were mechanics. They're mechanics from their country in the Caribbean. And some of them became apprentices and learnt the trade here. We have the scissors of a tailor. There are a lot of tailors. Milliners, hat makers. There's a hat maker in Bellenden Road area, and he'd make it with felt hats. So when people, going to parties or so, they'd want a fresh hat made. That was a very common trade, milliner. But obviously, when they came to the UK, there's less opportunities. The picture below the hat is the famous Singer sewing machine. A lot of dressmakers, seamstresses as we called them. One of the traditional things for women at home with children was to go into apprenticeship and to learn to, seamstress was one of the apprenticeships. So a lot of people came to the UK with those skills and they continue to use those skills in their home. So like when we think of the picture, the black and white picture on Bellenden Road, at that time when those men are rushing up and down, I noticed there weren't many women in that. Well, I didn't see any women in the picture. There would have been women maybe in the seamstress's home getting an outfit done up for a party or something or for a function. The seamstresses in the home was very common. We turn to the right-hand side of the top right-hand side and we see, nappy pins. Do you remember the old-fashioned terry towel in nappies? And the pins? A lot of childcare happened in the home. You go to work, you leave your child with somebody that was qualified or that you trusted. Below the childcare, you have the famous Caribbean Dutch pot or Dutchie, as they say. We know the famous song by Musical Youth, Pass the Dutchie on the left-hand side. It's referring to this Dutch pot, which is a symbol of cooking. Lots of culinary skills. It was just standard, We people from the Caribbean were able to, whether or not they were professional caterers, they catered for events, whether it was in the home or for other people. So that's what's symbol. Now the classroom there, a lot of people came over as they were qualified teachers in the Caribbean. But sadly, because of issues, they were not allowed, or they were told they had to retrain when they came to the UK. So a lot of the skills was lost because you had, obviously it cost to retrain, and it was a certain period of time it took. And if you had a family, you wouldn't have the opportunity, or you wouldn't have the resources to go through that again when you were already trained and were qualified in your profession. So lots of teachers came to the UK, talking about the Windrush generation. But even though they had the skills, they'd either do it in supplementary Saturday schools, but in the UK classrooms, a lot of them were prevented from doing so. And then below that, it's a bit harder to see. So the picture below, you see a shoe, and you see a shoe being made. Now, as I said, we had our famous shoemaker on Bellenden Road, and he, although it said shoe repairs, but he also made shoes. You can either have your shoe repaired, and that shoemaking was also a common vocation. And then again, that was through apprenticeship. Okay, and then at the bottom, somebody said the NHS. A lot of people came over as nurses. They were qualified in the Caribbean. That was part of Enoch Powell's recruitment. We know about the NHS and how the NHS was built up on the back of immigrant nurses. So that, and then one thing I should say before we move on to the next slide, and is just before the word legacy, there's a cross. There's a Jesus on the cross. Now, two of the other areas that was very significant with Caribbean households and why the housing was so important was church. The heart of the Caribbean community, they've revered church. So a lot of churches started in the home and then moved on to maybe halls and then some to church buildings. So the church was very important. And as well as the church, we can't forget the social side, in other words, the parties. So we had the Caribbean houses were very well known for keeping house parties. Some of them were formal house parties, some of them were less formal, and they were often termed as shebeen. in other words, basement parties. But also the Caribbean House was also instrumental in housing a lot of official functions. Just like I said, it was hard at one stage for people from the Caribbean, the council wouldn't lease industrial premises. So people had functions like weddings, christening parties, as well as things. So the Caribbean House was significant to the development and growth of the Caribbeans in Peckham, and this was their investment. All these industries, cottage industries and high street industries, which is a legacy that seems to be submerged somehow. So we move on to the next slide. And this is a picture of a place called Central Hall, which opened on 43 Peckham High Street on the 11th of November 1894 and was sold in 1935. So this is a heritage picture which I got from peckhamheritage.org, and it's very significant because apart from that heritage history, there was a more familiar heritage history, and when I say familiar, more familiar to myself. And between 1960 and 2000, this space was occupied by another form of heritage. So it was owned and operated by people from the Caribbean, and the particular phase that I'm familiar with when I went there, it was operated by a Jamaican businessman who has operated several spaces for social engagement. So this space, which is 43 Peckham High Street, has had different names between 1960 and the 2000, when it was predominantly occupied by. Can you turn off your speaker, please?
You get so crazy that at some point we should fear for our lives. Oh,
someone's got their speaker on. Thank you. Just waiting for that person to turn off their microphone. Thank you. All right, so between 1960 and 2000, it was very significant. And some of people in the audience might be familiar with these names if they went to this social club. So at one stage it was called the Westerner. Then it became Mr. B's. And then it became the Bouncing Ball, which is the more familiar name that people knew it by. And then it became Kiss's Night Spot. And then it ended its life as Chicago. So that space for 40 years or 40 plus years had been occupied by people from the Caribbean who put on events in that space between 1960 and 2000. And it was not just local events, it was international events. So if we just go on to the next slide, we can get a little snapshot of some of the events. So you see on the right-hand side a flyer of some of the events that took place. And this is when it was the Bouncing Ball. The resident DJ and the person who ran it at the time was Admiral Ken, and he's the man that you see in the picture to the left in front of the lorry. So he operated a resident sound system, which is a disco, what we say in UK terms disco, but resident sound system, but he also was the club owner. So he invited a lot of international acts to come to Bouncing Ball. If you look at we're going to ignore the picture with the right in the middle for now. If you look at the bottom of the screen, you see 3 photographs. The Ronettes played there, and Pat Kelly played there, and Desmond Dekker played there, if you're familiar with certain genres or certain genres of reggae. If you look at the middle picture, you'll see that Bob Marley was billed to appear there doing his Catch a Fire tour. And that shows the significance of the Bouncing Ball Club, that when certain artists came and did international tours or UK tours, the Bouncing Ball was one of the venues at which they appeared. Unfortunately for Bob Marley and his appearance at the Bouncing Ball, it didn't quite happen because he did come to the Bouncing Ball. But story has it that he had a dispute with the owner, and on that basis, he felt disrespected. He left the Bouncing Ball, but he did turn up. But he was billed to be there, and it was for more than one gig. Okay. We'll go on to another social space that people from the Caribbean occupied. And this is a pub at the time. in the period I'm talking about, it was the Walmer Castle. I know it changed its name to Farrows and then it closed down. But the significance of the Walmer Castle was that it was a venue of sorts. It was a respected, as this states in the writing, it was a respected jazz venue. And it played to artists from America and UK, and it had like talent shows. It was even a rock club at one time, but we know where rock has got its roots. And jazz greats like Ronnie Scott and Jamaican saxophonist Joe Harriott are listed as playing at the former Walmer Castle. So in the 60s and 70s, as Craig Jameson says in his account of the Walmer Castle, that the best jazzers in Britain would play the Friday and Saturday West End gigs, then come down to do a Sunday session at the Walmer Castle. So that is very significant that that pub was singled out as being as on par with the West End venues. And that was a Caribbean focused pub. Now I should say that people who live in Peckham now might think that the current pub, I'm just trying to recall the name, next to the bus garage was the first black pub in Peckham. Just trying to recall the names, and they'd be mistaken, because Peckham had a legacy of pub landlords and pub owners who were from the Caribbean. I'm talking about in the 60s, the 70s, even up to the 80s. And I'm just going to refresh some of your memory, and some of you might be already familiar, those on the Zoom. There's one pub that's still surviving in the Caribbean tradition, and that's the Golden Anchor. But other pubs, like the Oglander, Red Bull, Lord Lyndhurst, Wickenworth, Swiss Tavern, Kings on the Rye, and surrounding areas in East Dulwich, there were pubs. Further down Queens Road, Peckham, there were pubs. You know, there was a network of pubs owned by, either leased or owned by people from the Caribbean. And it was a thriving social network. And they also hosted live acts from international acts. All of that legacy has been erased. On Peckham High Street alone, if you go down to the bottom of Bellenden Road, there was at least 3 Caribbean pubs, apart from the Walmer Castle, which is further down the road on Peckham Road. So there was a whole network, and it became the alternative to nightclubs in terms of socializing, because obviously it was a smaller venue, it was more intimate, and you could see an international act, for example, in a more intimate space. There's no documented history of, that is significant of these venues. I see mention of these venues online, but the actual heritage, the Caribbean heritage linked to these venues, I've not found it to be of any significance, if mentioned at all. So we're going to go on to the next slide, and we're going to look at another space.
The book place, I don't know.
Yeah, so yeah, the book place, as you say.
Oh, when was this?
I can hear you. Okay, all right. So we're looking at the education, and remember when we looked at the slide, Not Our Problem, Sam King said there's 3 things to tackle inequality, and it was education, housing, and jobs. Now we're looking at education. So the book plays was it was been around from the 70s, but I was the education manager of the Peckham Literacy Centre, which was the parent company of the book place from 1989 to 1995. And when I arrived at the book place, the front looked just like this picture that I found online. There's more modern pictures, but this is the closest to what I recall when I started to manage the literacy centre at the book place. And I saw a need at the book place to supplement the standard core curricula, which was literacy, numeracy, ESOL, O-level English, O-level maths, and ICT, which was funded. And I decided that due to the demographics of the area, and we're talking about the book place is situated, for those who don't know, right on Peckham High Street in front of the North Peckham Estate. which at that time when I was there had not gone through regeneration. Well, it's not ended. It might have started, but it didn't end. And there's also the Peckham Publishing Project, for those on Zoom who are familiar with the small community publishing project, which empowered the local people to write their stories. And then there was obviously the bookshop, which was the book place, the front of it. And the book place sold books for the core curriculum. So it sold books that when schools brought their book lists, the book place would fill the book lists, and the local authority would pay on invoice for that on behalf of the school. But the book place actually widened its repertoire of books, and based on it again on the requirements of the mainly Caribbean community and the wider community, they actually started to stock specialist books, which was sourced from America. And at the time, the book place was one of a network of bookshops. Another one was Centerprise in Acne, and there are others that I can't recall at the moment. But it was a network of bookshops that had the same principle of education and by having classes and also providing the books and then publishing. That was the kind of formula. And the book place, why it was significant, because it was founded on the principles of, I don't know if any of you are familiar, Paulo Freire, who was a Brazilian Marxist who believed in eradicating illiteracy, and he had a certain method. And so his philosophy was replicated throughout the world. In Jamaica, we have Jamal, which it's changed its name now, but it was called Jamal initially, which is the Jamaican adult literacy movement. Different countries have different names, but it was started from Brazil. And on the back of the success of the book place and how it had appealed to the disenfranchised, I'll say, those who were marginalized, those who had problems with the education system, and that was primarily the Caribbean community, the Department for Environment afforded me an unlimited amount of money to open a technology centre. And I opened the Peckham Open Learning Centre on that. It wasn't situated on 13 Peckham High Street, where the book place was situated. It was further down the high street. And that Open Learning Centre was responsible for, we set up IT accredited courses, including MVQs, access courses. And it's really to give the local people an opportunity to move up in their education and get access to further education and then eventually higher education. Due to that operation, I had to attract certain funding streams. So I got quite a few funding streams: FEFC, LEA, small grants, Carlton Television Trust, National Lottery. The lottery had just come out. Esme Fairbairn Trust, Arts Council, Department of Environment, their North Peckham Task Force money, and European Social Fund. So I managed to expand a provision that was originally just for adult basic skills and tailor it to meet the needs of the community, and especially to encourage those immigrants in the wider community who would not have approached a standard educational provision to actually upgrade their education, so to speak. So whatever their starting point, whether they were totally illiterate or whether they just wanted to gain additional qualifications. And the one thing that I did was I targeted people who were teachers, qualified teachers in the Caribbean, who came to the UK and was told that their qualifications did not have any value and they'd have to retrain. I actually targeted them by putting on CPD, which I did myself because I'm a teacher trainer, and I gave them the tools to get back into the educational field. So I would say I had more than 50% success rate of people going back into teaching because they were given the platform to do so, and it wasn't via the Department for Environment, it was actually via the book place. I should also say another significance of the book place in terms of Caribbean community was that the book place also tried to offset the discriminatory policies of that the government brought in, which labelled Caribbean students educationally subnormal. Those of you on the Zoom might remember ESN as a term that was meant that it categorized children as having moderate learning disabilities, severe learning disabilities, or being unteachable. So that was the thing. And there was a whole movement, including Professor Gus John, who was always instrumental and also always active in fighting this label, which was just heaped on a portion of the community solely on the basis of their skin color. So an extract I got from the BBC kind of gives it in a nutshell. Black students were sent to these schools in significantly higher proportions. And in 1967, they found the ILIA report, which is Inner London Education Authority, that was responsible for education at the time in all the sectors, which showed that the proportion of Black immigrant children in ESN schools was 28%. And that was double that of those same children in mainstream school, which was 15%. So it's a deliberate targeting. And if you live in Peckham, you'd remember Ishaw School that used to be at the bottom of Bellenden Road. Well, that was one of the schools where they were targeted these young people. So it's primary and secondary, and that was an active government policy. So the book place was one of many venues across the country that provided supplementary schools to offset the injustice and the imbalance, what happened in, policy. So we used to allow space for Saturday classes and do additional activities for the children to assist them to get over that stigma of being labelled educationally subnormal, and also to get up to the level which they can progress in their education and be put back into a mainstream class. So the book place had many functions. We'll move on to the next slide and we'll look at another space which has been lost sadly, and that picture should be coming up next. Those of you who live in Peckham might recognise the person in the picture or the venue. Now this is Lloyds Barber Shop, 204 Bellenden Road. This barber shop is the site of the sitcom Desmond's. So in Desmond's, you'll see some of the interior of the shop. They used the exterior, they used other venues in Peckham, including Copperston Church, to film Desmond's. So one of the significance of Desmond as a lost community space is that it was more than a barber shop. It was, in fact, a community hub. So as a community hub, the space provided invaluable community services. And I'll list those. Employment. Lloyds and some of the other barbers, established barbers, they took on apprentices, barbering apprentices, to work as trainees, and also they took children from work experience. In secondary school, you have to do 2 weeks of work experience, and they took on children to give them that experience. It was also a cultural exchange. You had people from Africa and the diaspora. They would exchange their own cultural similarities, differences, and they'd talk about history and politics and colonization and immigration and all sorts of things that came to mind, but it was a cultural exchange. The barbershop also provided space for an educational exchange. And there, again, history, culture, politics was a standard debate on a daily basis. It was also a skills exchange network. So professional services were traded within the community. In other words, you didn't trade money, you trade services. So someone was established in gardening, for example, they'd do your garden, and somebody would say, all right, I'll bake you a cake if they were a baker, and so forth. So there's a skills exchange. And another thing that Lloyds, like a lot of spaces were known for, Caribbean spaces, was financial services. So one of the Caribbean traditions is to operate a partner, or in other islands they call it susu. For the UK purposes, we'll just equate it to a credit union. So basically, whoever was responsible in a particular establishment employed, if it was a person who I can't name, they would draw up a contract. Whoever wanted to be part of this collective, financial collective, would draw up a contract, and even if it's a verbal one, and they would save money. It would be saved collectively, and on a certain particular month or day, in rotation, the total of that financial pot would be given to the next person on the list. So people knew when they were expecting what they called a partner draw, and that money would be put to good use. It would be either for a holiday. In the early stages of discrimination, it was used altogether to buy houses. It could be to finance your child's education. It was used for so many things, but that was the mainstay. That was the main financial service that people relied on at the time, as they could not get loans or secure loans from the banks. Lloyds as a space also operated information, advice and guidance, IAG, because in Lloyds people would come with their problems and other people try and resolve it, or if not, they would give them counselling. People mentor, the elders would mentor the younger people, and so forth. So it had a lot of multi-purposes. It was also operated as a courier service. So at the time when transportation, people didn't travel as much, and the postal system was a bit more antiquated than now, and there was no internet. People would ask people when they're going on holiday, could you take this letter? It was usually a letter, or it was an item of goods, and could you give it to a family member? So people would do that, and then vice versa, when they're coming back, that family member they gave that envelope to might give them an item to bring back to that person. So that happened. And more importantly, when the shop was closed after shop hours on a Friday evening and a Saturday evening after shop hours, it would turn into a social hub, a space to relax and unwind. So Lloyd would, obviously selective customers and friends would come around at a certain time, and they'd relax to music, and might play traditional game of dominoes, would listen to music, would have traditional drinks. So it did so many things, Lloyd, as a space, and so many people benefited from that space. So we're going to go on to the next slide. And we're going to look at the question about Black urban removal. So as I said, Lloyd is one space, that's one of many spaces, but it did multiple things. That space is no longer there. Lloyd could not maintain the rent, or the rent kept on going up to astronomical figures, because obviously by now the area was gentrified, and he lost the space. So when I last looked on the estate agents, they said that there was a mention that 204 Bellenden Road, that's where Lloyd's was situated, London, is valued at £458,000 in today's market. It might have gone up since then. But the downside is, for the loss of that space, the social and cultural capital that was accumulated in that space alone, and then there's all the surrounding spaces, it's evaporated, because whilst people are making money out of this space, apart from the sales patter, when they're selling 204 Bellenden Road, the estate agent always writes in the title Desmond's, inverted commas, as a selling point. And that's the only way I see it mentioned. But in terms of the legacy of that space, there is nothing to suggest anything happened there. And the fact that a television program was based on that space for quite a long time, and it's repeated, I would have thought there would have been some kind of acknowledgement. I think acknowledgement is due, but sadly that hasn't happened. Now, when we talk about Black urban removal, we should also look at other causes. So rent increases are one cause, but there was also at one stage compulsory purchase orders, and I don't know if you're familiar with that, but that's when the local authority can deem that your property, whether it's your house, your business, is not of a fit standard, and it's fair judgment. And you don't have time to say, all right, give me such and such a time so I can make good and I can make repairs. They then give you the value what they want to, and they take that property from you. So a lot of housing stock, I know, because I know the former occupants were removed from people from the Caribbean at a certain time. Talking about 60s, 70s mainly, not so much the 80s. And what is striking with the properties that were repossessed by through CPO, compulsory purchase order, is that the properties were sold on to other families who renovated the properties and moved in. So whatever the inherent health and safety concern, it didn't seem to be displayed because the properties were just sold on for higher than what the price that the person was given. And often there also another cause is there is natural migration, but sometimes there's other reasons behind that migration, and it's not as clear cut as it may seem. Those from the Caribbean communities often talk and say they feel they were pushed out, and then, you know, if there's significant increases in the area and there's change of services, different types, there's rebranding. Some people thought, you know what, I can't afford to live anymore, I need to move. So Black urban removal, it might seem like we're just talking about a couple of businesses, but we're talking about a lot of cottage industries that occurred in the homes in the Bellenden renewal era, as one example. There's many examples around the whole of Peckham and in other neighbourhoods, Balham, Stockwell, Clapham, Brixton, you know, East London, we can name a lot, but for the purpose of this talk, it's just limited to this area. And when you think of the picture I showed you with all the industries on that one page, a lot of those operated in homes initially. And if the home has been possessed, repossessed through compulsory purchase order or through economic factors, you feel compelled to move out, then you've lost a lot in one building. It's not just that single purpose, it's multi-purpose. And that is the impact, is how many. And then also, in saying this, I should add that Bellenden Road alone, at one stage, and you know, Bellenden Road is a very long road. At one stage, there was a significant portion of Caribbean people that eventually owned their own homes. And you talk about 3-story homes. Like Brixton, the percentage is very minute now. So a lot of family homes were sold on. So you not only lost the cottage industry in those homes, you lost the generational link, because obviously those homes were different generations was lived in the same home. So when the houses went, then you lost a few generations in one house, for example. All right, so if we go on to the last slide, and this is about the social tectonics. In other words, the tectonic plates, if you know about geography and ecosystems, and this is a term that was coined, well, the term I like is coined by Jackson and Butler, and then also then. So basically what it is the impact of gentrification. And when you consider Bellenden Road is a very short road, and you have a parallel road called Rye Lane. Rye Lane is at least 4 to 5 times longer than Bellenden Road, a lot more active. But Rye Lane is the local, has become the local shopping area, whereas Bellenden Road is more a shopping area for more the gentrified members of the community. And what you find is, and how the picture illustrates it, right? The two roads do not unify. They're like they glide past each other, but there's no connection. And when you consider it's not even according to the RAC map, it's 0.048 of a mile. It's not even half a mile apart. It's a lot less than that. I think walking seems a lot less. But the two worlds don't meet. So the gentrifiers will pass through Rye Lane because they go to the station, and they might buy an odd exotic, inverted commas, food item. They might do that, but it's not their regular or preferred shopping area. There are social spaces that they use called like the Bussy building, which they have to cross Rye Lane to get in. It's on Rye Lane. But the local people do not shop on Bellenden Road. And it's like it's two different worlds. And if you cast your mind back to the picture, the black and white picture, that is Bellenden Road in its heyday when it was bustling with Caribbean businesses. And as you can see in the picture, there's a lot of people on the street. Now, that you wouldn't see if you were to assess the people that shopped on Bellenden Road now in the 21st century, today at this present time, you see a different demographic. So Bellenden Road is not seen as a local shopping area anymore. The local people go to Rye Lane or further, or other areas, Brixton or Croydon or Taunton Heath or wherever. But it's just changed. And so, but we must look at some of the positives of gentrification, because we can't always talk about it in negative terms. So then for the wider population, gentrification generates a sense of well-being, because it impacts on the level of crime rate and safer streets. So the argument is that with gentrification, the streets seem safer because the environment is cleaner and so forth. Another positive people see in gentrification is that there is an investment in the social, economic and cultural capital in the area, although it's targeted at those specific interest groups that the gentrifiers frequent. Another positive, it creates new developments, creative and cultural spaces. And you might have seen, like in Warwick Park, which is just off Lyndhurst, and which is a local park in the area, in the Bellenden Renewal area. They have, it seems like the park environment is cleaner. And also there's events in the park which did not used to happen before. There's also trends, like in terms of how the residence is portrayed, and the gentrified residents, like other phases of and other social groups, it's a uniform look in London. And the distinction is often there's that grey, like concrete grey kind of paint around the concrete of the windows, around the window frame, door frames. There's a kind of standard way of looking. It's uniform. And then the front gardens often replace the grass is often replaced, and it's replaced with slate. So slate tiling on the floor or on the ground. So there's a kind of different look. And often if you go around Bellenden Road, for example, and surrounding roads, you can look at the houses which have a standard type of decor, exterior decor, and you can more than likely assume it's a house occupied by what we'd call a gentrifier. Also, another positive, it raises the standards of living, because it obviously is corporate lifestyle. Certain professions move into the area. Inevitably, the shops and so forth, like Payless, which is now Village Grocers, rebrand to accommodate the newcomers and the new money, because there's a lot of money there. Gentrifiers often promote alternative or additional cultural pursuits. In the Bellenden Renewal area, there's quite a few yoga studios which do hot yoga. Before that, as an educator, I'm aware that there were yoga classes put on at the adult education centre, but then those classes was always filled up quickly because it was a very rare thing, and it was only maybe 1 or 2 classes. But there's a lot of private yoga studios now. That's a new departure from the normal social pursuits that happened within the Bellenden Renewal area. And there's an increase in educational facilities. For example, we have a free school now called the Bellham, and we have more private nurseries, and with a wider curriculum, like modern foreign languages taught in the nursery. So those are things that people see as positives. In terms of the other side of things that might not seem so positive, Spike Lee spoke about the Christopher Columbus syndrome. So in saying that, he felt in the same occurrence happening in Bed-Stuy in Brooklyn, where he was born and raised. He said that gentrifiers, what he said, colonize areas, referring to Christopher Columbus. In other words, they come and they see what's there before, they rebrand it, and then they pass it off as their own without giving credit to the original community that brought those ideas there in the first place. Think about the Caribbean community and a lot of changes and a lot of influences they had in the Bellenden Renewal era. For an example, that's been undone in a way that whatever's there, it's just been built on, but then owned by the gentrifiers. So that's seen as a negative. Another person, think about also the video where the local people were saying what they felt about the gentrification. They show indifference to authenticity of established community. So kind of like, you're there, but you're there. There's no acknowledgement. Another negative was the Casper effect. Do they really see anybody else but themselves? It's like a ghostly existence. They see through you, but they don't see you. Okay, that was another comment. Another negative was they lack spatial awareness, and they've been practicing social distancing before the pandemic. So when they talk about lacking social awareness, think about all the pushchairs. It's a very common sight to see 1 and 2 and 3 people side by side with their pushchairs having a conversation whilst they're out jogging. Local people you see sometimes have to walk around them and walk in the road. Where is the spatial awareness? There's certain levels of entitlement people have said that they find negative to do, linked to gentrification. Another negative that they've invested, yes, but only in the crafted cultural spaces endorsed by their peers. A lot of pop-up shops and other shops, but they're frequented by their peers. So the investment is limited because it only serves their small inner circle. It doesn't serve the wider community. They show reluctance to invest in the social, economic and cultural capital. In other words, they're nomadic. They pass through an area, they set up shop, they get what they feel they need to get, they make it their own, and then they move on very quickly. So there's no long-term investment, no long-term stay, and no integration or little integration. They generate price increases, people say, which is a negative. We see, because it prices people out of the market. And also consumables, rebranding of the village grocers. The prices have gone up, rebranding of Leyland's Kebabs, which is now Sam's Kebabs. There's a massive difference in the price of goods and other shops. And also the price increase was in the leisure facilities. They have their own leisure facilities that is not open. Well, it is open to anybody, but where is it advertised? Are the wider community aware that it's there? So these are some of the issues that people feel around the impact of gentrification in terms of the positives and also the negatives. So if we just, before we turn to the last slide, I just want to make a distinction here, is that when we refer to the middle classes, we have to make a distinction. The established middle classes are those of a certain income who have come to the area because they like what they learned about the area often before getting there. And they've made a conscious decision to be, they might have their own lifestyle and thing going on, but they also part of the community. And they're not afraid to associate with the community, to invest in whatever's there, to bring in new ideas, but opening up to the wider community. Whereas the gentrifiers might be the same income bracket and might be part of the same professions, but they have come in with a mindset to keep themselves apart from the community. So they've separated themselves. So it's not good to just say middle classes are all the same. They're not. There's those who are long-term and feel part of the community and want to be part, and they've often raised more than one generation in that community. And there's the gentrifiers whose mindset is literally that's a cheap area, we can achieve this here over this short period of time, move on, go to another area, and so forth till they relocate maybe permanently in the countryside later on at the end of their career. So there's an actual distinction, and we must keep that in mind. So back to the last slide now. And it's all around the government's policy of levelling up, and it kind of can present problems, this levelling up theory, because if people start off on an unequal footing, how are you going to level it up so if everybody enjoys the same thing? And this book from the New Economics Foundation is very timely. It came out this year, and it states that forced gentrification may improve many of the metrics of levelling up in a given area, but it pushes poorer families to move around the country to find housing and work. And you and I know that the work is a sore point because, the idea of work is not that easy to come by. So in looking at this levelling up concept, let's revert back to, in your minds, to the slide not our problem, 1984. And in the words of the late Mayor of Southwark, Sam King, in terms of talking about inequalities and relevant to levelling up, as he says, whenever people or institutions stop other people from living a normal life, for example, education, housing or jobs, there'll always be inequality. So how do you level up if these things are not at the same level? Do people have the same access to education, housing, jobs? You know, think about regeneration, think about gentrification, and I'm going to leave you, the audience, with a question. The final question: is regeneration, in brackets renewal, or gentrification, in brackets alternative growth, responsible for the breakdown in communities, Caribbean communities, displacement, and reallocation of their spaces? Does it play a significant factor? I'll leave it up to the audience. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Charmaine. Thank you, Charmaine. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm just going to open up. I mean, sorry, we've slightly overrun on time. We don't have a massive amount of time for questions, but anyone want to dive in and ask Charmaine a question or respond to Charmaine's question that she put to everyone? Ruth, you're the first hand I see.
I wasn't responding to the question because I put my hand up before the question.
Okay.
That is a big question. I got loads of things I've written down. It was so interesting. I've known Peckham all my life. I was born around there and everything, and I've seen it change a lot. Just some observations. Some of the things, though, apply to other people. My parents were in that area right from whenever it was, the 50s, I suppose. And so they were very working class and they didn't have great educations. Both of them went to evening classes. My father was still going to evening classes when I was an older child, really. So that's the way it was. It was hard. The mobility was harder. Being able to do things, being able to get the jobs you wanted were harder. The points that were made about the pubs and shops closing down, that applies to a lot of pubs and shops. Well, maybe the pubs more than the shops, but that sense of community. And also, but I also saw inner London very run down in the 70s. You wouldn't believe it now unless you were in my position. But as a student, some of those council housing estates couldn't be let. And it was easy as a student to get a council flat in New Cross. Actually, I got one in Deptford in the end, but because people didn't want to live there. That's how bad things were getting. So actually, to me, although I moved away, it was actually great for me to come back and think Peckham has reinvented itself. It's changed, but it's thriving. And that's probably the secret of a good place. That's how I saw it when I came back and saw it in the 80s, 90s, and actually now as well. However, I do get the point about the gentrification, and it seems strange to me even. I've certainly seen Lordship Lane in that area change beyond recognition, really. And I think what I see generally in that part of South London is there's too much. I think if you have too much of something, the gentrification and high density and all the flats and certain types of people, the lack of the diversity is actually probably a really bad thing, particularly on a large scale, because that is gentrification, isn't it? And I don't know if that's what anybody really wants in the long term. I don't think that's good in the long term.
Okay, you're saying a lot, and I need to. You said you wanted me to. Did you want me to comment on some of the things, or did you just want to talk?
Well, just one last thing I was going to say.
Okay.
You should also be proud of your sense of community, because I don't think a lot of places where I grew up had that. So if that's something you had, that's something I missed. So that's a lovely thing to hang on to.
Okay, thank you. You said a lot of things. I'll have to cast my mind. All right, so let me look at the first thing you said about it kind of as a general thing everywhere. The point I'm trying to make with this presentation and others I've made is that where it's documented for other communities, it's not documented for Caribbean communities. And it's a matter of getting our heritage and history in these spaces actually documented, because, you know, it's just like food. You have the impact of the empire on a lot of things that happen in the UK now, in Britain now. It was certain things that was brought to Britain and cooked a certain way. It's now influenced how people dine. They're dining just like the Caribbean, for example, jerk. I mean, there's always been barbecue. Barbecue's been a standard thing. But our style of barbecue, which is jerk, is unique to Jamaica, for example. And it's replicated that style in other communities. And for, you know, a jerk wouldn't have been a thing, standard thing in England. It would have been just you go to a barbecue, you have whatever you have on the barbecue. We brought in another style distinct to the Caribbean, which is now even quoted by top chefs on TV. You see cooking programs, Saturday's Kitchen and others, where they're representing jerk, but in a way that is not authentic. But the fact is they've taken the idea and thought, oh, this is a good development in terms of food preparation and fine dining. And they brought in, and you know, gentrification is a well-written topic, well talked about, and in terms of communities, but nowhere in the literature and in any of my research from 2014 have I found where anybody has documented the impact of the Windrush generation on the impact of gentrification on the Windrush. And I'm trying to capture the voices of what I say dispossessed, because they feel their voices are not heard, their contributions are not heard, and there's no one representing them. So I'm just trying to represent what's not being talked about, not the general stuff that's already out there. So that's why this is my take, is to represent the bits that I find in the history documentation that's missing. Even in Peckham Heritage, Peckham History, all these history groups. And when I look at all the history of Peckham and I look at Regeneration, there's nowhere in any of these documentation remember the sizable Caribbean communities, the Windrush generation that came to Peckham, lived there for quite a long time, invested in Peckham, left a legacy which has been submerged in a way and kind of erased. And I just want to put it back on the map that all histories are invaluable. All histories should be represented. If you're representing history, you've got this everything or nothing. It can't be selective bits of history. I'm just trying to put back the bits that have been left out for whatever reason. Also, just quickly,
Charmaine, we've got a hand up here. I just want, sorry to interrupt you. I just wonder if we should let someone else.
Yes. Right, fair enough.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's Patrick Hewson.
No, it's actually, my name's not Greta. That's my daughter's name. No, I'm Robert Hewison.
Robert, sorry, Robert.
That's all right.
Just remember.
And of course, Charmaine's work was very helpful to me when I was doing my book, Passport to Peckham.
Okay, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too, Charmaine. And I really, found what you've already written extremely useful. But I would say in my own defense that in Passport to Peckham, I have actually tried to engage with several communities. I mean, it's interesting you don't mention the West African community.
No, because
so I understand your story, but my feeling is that, yes, there are losers in gentrification, but quite a lot of people who had been forced by circumstances to buy their own houses were then actually able to sell them quite profitably and say move to Lewisham and so on. So although I completely accept your argument about Bellenden Road and so on, I think it's more nuanced than just saying, well, gentrifiers are bad people.
No, there's positives and negatives, as I said a lot. And I should say to you on the reference to West African, the talk is about the Caribbean, and there's so much out there, but I have a personal interest being from Jamaica, being from the Windrush generation, and having access to people of different generations from the Caribbean who have spoken to me on and off for quite a few years on this topic. And that's why I've kind of made it very distinct, the Caribbean population. Maybe at another stage in my research, I'll look at the West African, but at the time it was the Caribbean that had out of all the population of Black people in Peckham, it was the Caribbean that was the biggest percentage because of the Windrush. So that's why the focus is on people I have access to that can tell me their stories, and they're from the Caribbean, not West Africa.
Yeah, they were pioneers, as it were, but then so were some of the people who, like the artists and so on that I write about. They too were pioneers, and that is what makes Peckham such a wonderful place.
Yes,
of course, I would make the point, I don't live in Peckham, but in fact, my kids have.
Even the French Huguenots were pioneers in Peckham and have a history here, you know. But as I say, I'm trying to fill a gap for those from the Caribbean who feel they're voiceless. I'm trying to fill that gap with my research. Other people will fill other gaps, but that's my focus. Thank you.
We're approaching the end. I don't know if we could squeeze in one more question. Anybody got anything else to add? Otherwise, Charmaine, you've just given us so much to think about. It's been fantastic just beginning to fill this gap and add in all these other stories and accounts of life in Peckham. So thank you so much. It's been absolutely brilliant.
Thank you for having me.
Just to remind everyone, we've recorded this talk and we're going to upload it onto the Peckham Heritage website. So if you feel like somebody else might be interested in it, we'll let you know when the talk is uploaded, and you can share the link with others and spread the word about the content of Charmaine's talk.
And thank you to everybody who's attended and those who've participated. Thank you, Claire.
Let's have a round of applause for Charmaine. Thank you very much, Charmaine. Amazing.
Well done, Charmaine. Great job.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Okay.
Great job.
All right then. All right then. Thank you. All right then.
Good
Bye.
night, everyone. Thanks
Bye.
everyone for coming.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. That was great.
Thank you, Charmaine. That's it.